You know what no one on the internet has done yet? A video about speed paints. Let's give that a shot. What's up, everybody? So, all joking aside, you've probably seen a ton of videos about Army Painter speed paints around the internet for the past couple of months. But most of the videos that I've seen really expect you to know a lot about painting in order to understand them. So I want to go through in a way that is beginner friendly, whether you're new to speed paints or painting miniatures in general, and give you some of the tips and tricks that I found from my experimenting with the paints. There's a few things that I ran into that I actually don't see a lot of other people talking about. And no, I'm not going to get into the whole reactivating thing because I think that's been talked about to death already. And you can find other people that can speak to that better than I can. So if you like this video, make sure you give it a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And check out the description below for a link to the Discord and the Patreon if you're interested in those. But let's get into it. So to start off, the only thing we're going to be using here is the Army Painter Speed Paint Starter Set. This set retails for $45, and it comes with 10 different paints with a pretty good variety of colors. And as we'll talk about in a minute, you can always mix some new colors if you need to. In addition to that, you're going to need a can of white primer and, of course, a paintbrush. It's super important that you prime the models white or a very light gray in order to use the speed paints. And in addition, I'd highly recommend that you put in a little extra effort to make sure the whole model is primed. Sometimes I'll be a little lazy and miss some of the undercuts or maybe the back of the model. But in this case, you really want to make sure you hit everything with the white primer. I went through my collection to figure out what kind of models I wanted to experiment on, and I found these goblins for Kings of War. I think these are a great candidate because there's a ton of them, and they can take a really long time to paint, so if I can cut that down a little bit, that'll be really great. And then to switch up the color palette a bit, I also picked out this Chaos Cultist from 40K. I forgot to take a picture of him before I started painting, but it's this guy right here. Now, the first thing you're going to want to do is shake these things up, because they definitely have a tendency to separate a bit. But conveniently, they actually come with a little agitator ball inside that makes it a little easier to mix them up. So I started out by painting the goblin's skin green, because he's a goblin, so of course. Now, the first thing you're going to notice is that this paint kind of goes on like a wash, which is to say it's pretty thin, and you'll notice it kind of pooling up into some of the recessed areas. But that's exactly what you want from the speed paint, and you'll see why as we get into it here. Next, I used the hardened leather color. Now, I really like this color. I think it's great for doing wood, leather, and anything else that you want to be a kind of light brown. I started putting it on the wooden parts of the shield, and you can already see that it sort of brings out some of the grain there that would be pretty tough to do with a traditional paint. And next, I realized that this set doesn't come with any metallic colors, and that's because they don't make any metallic speed paints. But I wanted to stick with only using the speed paints. So I grabbed the gray color and started putting it on the metal parts. Now, at first, I didn't really love the look, but as it started to dry, I actually kind of came around on it. It left the sword and some of the armor with a look of like dented metal with a sort of dull finish. I actually think it came out pretty good. Now, one of the things I was most curious about before I got my hands on these paints is whether they would mix together well. So I mixed a little bit of the dark gray in with the leather to see if I could get a dark brown color. And it worked really well. It pretty much did exactly what I expected. So being that that worked out, I decided to try to make a color for the clothes here. And I wanted a deep and rich brown. So I took the leather brown, mixed it with the gray at about a 2-to-1, and I found that it was a little too desaturated, so I ended up adding a drop of blue and red, which brought it back to a nice saturated brown, and I was pretty happy with how that worked. Now let's talk a bit about how you actually want to put these paints down. As you can see, you want to put them on pretty thick, no watering down like you do with normal paint. But you do want to keep an eye on the areas where it pools. You don't want to really flood an area on the model. You kind of want to spread it around evenly, again, sort of like how you might use a wash. Another thing you want to look out for is going back over the same area. You don't want to do that. Try to make sure you apply the paint and then move on to a new area without going back and running the brush back over the same area. If you do that, some of the paint that was already put down might have dried partially, and then you'll end up getting weird tide marks or streaks in that spot. But don't worry about it too much. It's really not that tough. Just sort of lay the paint down evenly and keep going. So then I put some red on his little helmet tassel, and then I went around and picked out a few different colors to differentiate some of the different parts of the goblin, like his belt and his shoes, and the various other little bits, just to make them stand out a bit. Now, one mistake that I made was when I was painting his skin, I painted his mouth and teeth with the same green. So off camera, I went back and fixed the teeth, because obviously we don't want them to look green. But that gets to another important point here. This paint is pretty forgiving, but one of the big mistakes that you can make is painting sloppy. Because the paint is going down on a white primer, if you get a color somewhere where it doesn't belong, it's actually going to show through pretty significantly when you try to go back in and paint it over with the color you intended to use. So you want to be really careful when you're painting that you kind of color in the lines. And if you do make a mistake, try to clean it up with a fresh brush, or if you don't get to it in time, leave it to dry and then paint over it with a really pale gray or a white. That way you get an even finish when you put the intended color over it. So that's a goblin down. It went by really quick. It's pretty easy to do. This is by no means a gorgeous paint job, and I certainly could have done a better job if I had painted it the old-fashioned way. But I would guess that that would probably have taken me about 3 times as long. And for the amount of time I spent on this thing, I think it looks really good. So I ended up painting up a couple of ranks of these guys, and this is what they look like when they're all done. I gotta say, these would have taken many times longer if I had done them the old-fashioned way, but we'll get back to that in a bit. Let's move on to this Chaos Cultist. To start, I wanted to paint him like the art, so I mixed up a brown skin tone using orange and blue, because that's what Google told me to do. And Google knows everything. And then I just started applying the paint, same as before. One pretty generous coat, and making sure not to go back over any spots, and making sure to color in the lines. After that, I used the leather brown on his pants, and mixed in some other colors for the shoes. You can kind of just mix and match here, to get some different, interesting looking leather, or fabric. For the clothing on these cultists, the art shows them as this purple color, so I mixed up some red with a little bit of blue to try to get as close as possible. And I definitely didn't get exactly the same color, but I did get a purple that I kind of like, so I just went with it and colored in the rest of the fabric. Now for his gun, it's kind of got two different colors of metallic on it. One's a darker color, and one's a lighter steel color. And this poses kind of a problem here. Now of course if you're doing this at home, you could just use a metallic color to cover the shinier bits. But I wanted to stick to using the speed paints. So I decided to first go through with the same gray to do all the dark bits, while I tried to think about what I'd do on the rest. I also went in and painted the gun magazine in his hand, as well as some of the other metal bits around the model. And again, I was reasonably happy with how those came out. It's not going to be shiny metallic, but it looks pretty good when it's all dried. After that, I needed this kind of aqua or cyan color, so I took the blue speed paint and added a little bit of green to it. I actually really like the color I mixed up for this, so I went in and did the rest of these little cloth bits that are hanging around everywhere. And after that, I decided I had to finish off the weapon, so I decided to just water down the gray color, and hope that it would give me a kind of pale looking metal. And I don't think it really worked very well. If I was going to do this again, I would probably use the gray for some of the metallic bits, but then I'd go in with a metallic paint for the shiny parts, and then just hit it with a wash. It wouldn't take much more time than just using the speed paints, and I think it would give a much better effect. And then the last touch was to go in and hit the gold colored metallics with the yellow speed paint. And this doesn't look too bad, but kind of like the steel, I think you're better off using a real metallic paint, and then just putting a wash over it. Again, it won't take too much more time. So let's talk for a second about how these paints actually work. Now, just like a wash that's thin and meant to seep into the recesses to add a shade, these speed paints do basically the same thing, but they're definitely a little bit thicker and they have more pigment to them. The other big difference is that typically when you use a wash, you put it over something that was already painted, and that's where we get to the importance of using the white primer. Because you're putting these over a white primer, the recessed areas are still getting shaded, but the raised areas are only getting a little bit of the tint, and you're still mostly going to be able to see the white primer. This is why you get these really bright colors, and you can even see that in some areas, the edges almost look like they were edge highlighted from where the paint barely touched. Again, keep in mind, I didn't do anything to these except for hit them with the speed paint. But this is also why it's really important that you be neat when you paint, because with that white primer showing through, if you spilled over any other paints before you put the speed paint on top, you'd see it pretty bad. And this is also why it's so important that you make sure you prime the entire model evenly and you don't miss any spots. I ended up painting up the rest of these cultists, and once again, it was pretty quick, and I'm pretty happy with the results. Now, there was one issue that I ran into with the speed paints, and I'm not sure how common this is because I haven't seen other people complaining about it, but you may have noticed that my red paint had sort of spilt all over the outside of the bottle. And the reason for that is that not long after opening it for the first time, I took the cap off and noticed that it kind of exploded like a pen. There was paint all up underneath the cap, and I had stored it right side up, so I'm not really sure why this happened. It didn't happen with any of the other paints, so I guess I'll have to keep an eye on it and see if it happens again in the future. But maybe this is one point in favor of the pots that GW uses. I don't think I wasted much of the paint, but I definitely got it all over my hands, and it made kind of a mess. Now, as far as the colors you get in this set, I think there's a pretty decent selection, but some are better than others. I think leather brown, the red, and the gray color are all really good. I had some problems with the green color. It almost seems like the pigment is too strong, because on a lot of the goblins, you don't really get that high contrast that you get with some of the other colors. It kind of just tints the whole surface a pretty deep green. Now, it could be that I put it on too thick, or maybe it needs to be thinned down a bit, but I wasn't as impressed with this as the other colors. Some of the colors I didn't get a chance to use alone, but I will say that Pallid Bone and Crusader Skin were not my favorite. Because they're lighter colors, they don't have as much of an effect, and I also think the set would have been better off with a different variety. If you're going to add to this set, Army Painter does make a dark brown, as well as a black and a white color, and those might be good choices in and of themselves, or potentially to mix with some of the other colors. So my thoughts overall on the speed paints, to be honest, they work a lot better than I expected them to. I was pretty surprised at how quickly you can slap these things down onto a miniature and get a pretty decent looking result. It's certainly not going to win any awards, and they're not really good for painting on metallics. But if you need to paint up a whole unit in a short period of time, or you're doing a mass battles army, these things are going to save you a ton of time. They're not super easy to use, but I do think they'd be good for beginners, especially if you're the type of person who finds it hard to get motivated to paint, or you don't like painting. If you just want to get some paint on your miniatures so you can put them on the table, then this is a good way to go. On the other hand, if you're someone who does want to get better at painting, and does enjoy the process, then these might not be what I'd recommend for you. And the reason I say that is because if you're using the speed paints as a shortcut, then you're not really going to be practicing any of the techniques that you're going to need to learn to become a better painter. Sure, you'll get some practice with brush control, but if you're just using the speed paints, then you're not going to learn other techniques like dry brushing, blending, or layering. Now, you can certainly definitely do a hybrid approach and use speed paints in combination with other paints. And that's probably what I'd recommend if you're someone who wants to get a little bit deeper into the hobby. But I know there's a ton of people out there who really just consider painting a chore that they have to do in order to play their games. And if you're a person like that, then I would go out and pick up the speed paint starter set, because honestly you'll be able to do most of what you want to do just with those 10 paints. But overall I actually found this a lot of fun, and even though I didn't like how it worked on the metallics, it actually made me wonder what else I could use these speed paints for. I think I have a Space Marine sitting around here somewhere. But anyway, drop me a comment and let me know if you're interested in speed paints or contrast paints and what your experience has been like with them so far. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, check out the socials, hop over to the Discord, and even check out the Patreon if you're interested in that. And thanks for watching.